One of the most pressing questions and objections when it comes to Christianity is what's often called the problem of evil. In fact, just a few years ago, a couple of my doctoral students did a survey of recently graduated college students, many of whom had walked away from their faith during college. And one of the number one issue that they said was problematic for them in the Christian faith was the problem of evil. They couldn't reconcile how a God who is good and powerful can allow for the existence of evil in the world. Bart Ehrman, who is a skeptic who walked away from the faith, and there's many things he does that attacks the Bible and attacks the New Testament and attacks the Gospels, but if you really drill down, you find out in his book, God's Problem, that the reason he actually walked away from the Christian faith was not the problems he saw in the Bible, but rather the problem of evil. Here's what he had to say. He said, "I felt compelled to leave Christianity because I could no longer explain how there can be a good and all-powerful God actively involved with this world given the state of things. For many people who inhabit this planet, life is a cesspool of misery and suffering. I came to a point where I simply could not believe that there is a good and kindly disposed ruler who is in charge of it all." And this, of course, is not simply an apologetics problem. It's a very practical and pastoral problem. You will deal with this one. You may never deal with people who say, "I just don't think there can be miracles in a world governed by natural law." You may never find somebody who objects to the resurrection of Jesus in the way that we talk about in this class. But you will inevitably run into people who are struggling with the problem of evil. I remember many times as a pastor in which I've dealt with this. And I remember in one particular instance, a woman who was in the ICU with her daughter who had been picked up off the highway after having been pushed out of a van by people who were on drugs, and the daughter had been on drugs, and this mother had become a Christian, and she was the one who had introduced her daughter to drugs, but then the mother had become a Christian and left that lifestyle behind. And she's in the ICU. And I saw there, as I saw this mother in the ICU and her daughter dying, there's not any hope for her daughter at this point. And I saw how badly it can go when this is handled poorly, because here's what I saw happen. I saw, as I got there, a health and wealth preacher from across town who was there, and he told the woman, he said, "This is because of God punishing, and if you will just have enough faith, God will heal your daughter." And you have this mother left with this burden of believing it's my fault what's happened to my daughter. And if I could just have enough faith, my daughter's going to come through this. And she lived with the burden of that. And it took her years to get rid of that burden, but that's dealing badly with the problem of evil. That's a pastor who told a lie in terms of Scripture, what Scripture has to say, but who sincerely believed it was true in a moment of suffering and put a burden on somebody of a falsehood because of dealing poorly with the problem of evil. We've got to be able to deal well with this problem. We have to be able to deal with this problem in a way that leaves people not with a burden of guilt, nor that frees them from guilt, either one, because only the cross of Jesus Christ and the gospel should be able to deal with their guilt. But we have to do this in a way that helps them to see the truth of God and to see the glory of God, but also to see their suffering in light of who God is. We have to handle this one well. You cannot, in your pastoring, in your teaching, in your engagement with your children, in your leadership of your small group, you can't get this one wrong. You've got to get this one right. And I want to help us to do that over these sessions on the problem of evil. Now let's look at it first from a more academic side and look at what is often called the Epicurean trilemma. The Epicurean trilemma. Now, the Christian writer Lactantius, he gives this idea of this trilemma, and he attributes it to the Greek philosopher Epicurus. And so that's why it's called the Epicurean trilemma, is because it's attributed to the philosopher Epicurus, and it's done by the Christian writer Lactantius. Now, even though Lactantius talks about it, Epicurus talks about it, this is something that goes back throughout the history of humanity. It's just that this particular syllogistic form, we might say, originates or was popularized or made known by Epicurus. This is something that is a problem that is as ancient as humanity. So Epicurus, he says, look, God is all good, God is all powerful, evil exists. He gives these three propositions. God is all good, God is all powerful, evil exists. And he says, in essence, any two of those could be true, but all three of them can't be true. You can't have all three of them be true. And so throughout the history of time, people have tried to solve this in different ways. Some of them by denying one of those three things. Some people might say that God is all good and all powerful, but they deny the existence of evil. That's Christian Science, says that evil is just an illusion. Suffering is just an illusion. So God is all good, God is all powerful, but suffering doesn't really exist. It's only an illusion. Some people might say that God is all good and evil exists, but God is not all powerful. That's what's often called process theology. That is this idea that God is so bound up in his universe that God is developing and in process with his universe, but God can't actually stop evil. But we as Christians, as believers of the scriptures, we have to affirm all three of those. God is all good. God is all powerful. And evil exists. Now, for us to understand this, we've got to set this up in such a way that helps us to understand that there are two types of evil and actually three problems of evil. Two types of evil and three problems of evil. Let's first look at the two types of evil. The first type of evil is moral evil, and the second type is surd evil. Surd, S-U-R-D, surd evil. Moral evil is the action of a moral agent against God's will. It may be a moral agent who's an angel. It may be a human being. It's somebody who sins at some level. That's moral evil. That's the action of a moral agent against God's will. But there's also another type of evil, and it is known as surd evil, from the Latin surdus, which means mute or neutral. And it's an event or a state of affairs that brings about suffering that's not due to a moral evil. It's not due to something somebody did. It's just due to something that has happened apart from an act of any moral agent. Cancer, natural disasters that cause human suffering and death, COVID-19. These different things are surd evil. They are evil, but they are surd evil. And it's important that we distinguish moral evil and surd evil, because the way we respond to them and the way we engage with people that things happen to is different based on whether it was moral evil or surd evil. We have to be able to distinguish those and recognize them as different from one another. At the same time, though it's important for us to distinguish them, it's also important for us to recognize that surd evil ultimately traces back to moral evil. No matter how you understand it as a Christian. You have people like Alvin Plantinga, Greg Boyd, and others who make the point that it could be that surd evil is caused by demons. That's certainly possible. The other view would be, the more traditional Reformed view would be that surd evil, that whatever has happened that is surd evil, that is evil enacted on human beings, but it's not something that is a moral action. It is something that brings about suffering that happens to humanity, is ultimately traceable back to Adam's moral evil, Adam's sin against God. So surd evil ultimately traces back to moral evil, no matter what. But it's still important for us to distinguish between moral evil, which is direct, an act of rebellion against God, and something that is indirect, not traceable back to a particular moral agent in that moment, though it's ultimately traceable back to a moral agent, called surd evil. So we have two types of evil. Now, we also have to recognize not only are there two types of evil, there are actually three problems of evil, or problems of evil and suffering. Okay, we have to understand that there are three problems of evil. The three problems of evil are the logical problem of evil, the evidential problem of evil, and the existential problem of evil. And you have to be able to understand and engage with each of those differently. The logical problem of evil is simply this. It's somebody that says that the evil in the world makes it logically inconsistent for somebody to believe in God. Evil disproves God's existence logically. That's the logical problem of evil. The logical charge that it is inconsistent to believe in an all-good, all-powerful God and to recognize the evil in the world. That is logically inconsistent. It is irrational, therefore, to believe in God. That's the first problem of evil. The second problem of evil is the evidential problem of evil, the evidential problem. And it is a little bit more modest in what it asserts. It says that the evil in the world is so vast. There's so much evil in the world that it makes it unlikely that there's a God. The evidential problem of evil, the person isn't asserting that there can't be a God or that it is irrational to believe in God, but really that it's unlikely that there's a God, given how much evil exists in the world. And the last one is the existential problem of evil. That's why is there disproportionate suffering? Why does that person suffer so much and that person suffers so little, and that person seems like they don't deserve suffering, and this person seems like they do deserve suffering? Why is it disproportionate? And why am I suffering? And why does the person I love suffer? That's the existential problem of evil. So let's look at each one of those. We're going to look in detail at each one of these, beginning with the logical problem of evil. And in this, I'm leaning really heavily on a man named Alvin Plantinga, who is a very prominent philosopher. Even secular philosophers recognize Alvin Plantinga has in some sense eliminated the logical problem of evil. And so he, in one of his books, he attacks this idea that it is inconsistent or irrational to believe in an all-good, all-powerful God in the light of evil in the world. And he says, well, okay, what does it mean really to say that it is irrational or inconsistent to believe in God? He says, well, we have to ask what we mean by inconsistent. How is it inconsistent for us to believe in God? And he says, for us to really understand that issue, we have to recognize there's actually three types of inconsistency. He says one of them is logical inconsistency. Logical inconsistency. That is that one assertion in a set denies one or more of the others. And so that one's pretty simple. We could say, we'll give an example of this, and somebody might say Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, is the greatest movie ever made, which it is. Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back is the greatest movie ever made. And then they could say in the next sentence, Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back is not the greatest movie ever made. That would be a logical inconsistency. One of the statements in the set denies the other statement in the set. But as anybody can see, that can't be the type of inconsistency we're talking about here. Because an all-good, all-powerful God, nothing about that it denies, explicitly denies, the existence of evil. There's nothing in that. It's not a logical inconsistency. None of the statements in that set, God is all good, God is all powerful, evil exists, none of the statements in that set explicitly deny any of the other statements. So it can't be that. So he says, okay, the logical problem of evil, is it a logical inconsistency? Nope, not a logical inconsistency. He says, secondly, is it a formal inconsistency? A formal inconsistency. Now, a formal inconsistency is one in which an explicit inconsistency can be logically deduced from the statements. An explicit inconsistency can be logically deduced from the statements. So, let's think of it this way. Mandalorian. And if I were to say, all Mandalorians are mortal, I am a Mandalorian, I am immortal. All Mandalorians are mortal, I am a Mandalorian, I am immortal. That's a formal inconsistency. It's also not true because I'm not really a Mandalorian. But we're talking about the logical sets right here. That's a formal inconsistency. because you can, by the laws of logic, deduce an explicit inconsistency, a logical inconsistency, from this statement. Because you see, if all Mandalorians are mortal and I am a Mandalorian, then I can't be immortal. That's not possible. But going back to our statements again, nothing about the statement evil exists creates an explicit inconsistency with an all-powerful, all-good God. But not only that, it doesn't create a formal inconsistency. It doesn't create a formal inconsistency. There's nothing in the laws of logic that would say that there's something you can deduce from those three statements that causes a contradiction. So Plantinga says, okay, first it's not an explicit logical consistency. Then he says, no, it's not a formal inconsistency. And so he says there is a third type of inconsistency. So he's ruled out the explicit inconsistency. He's ruled out the formal inconsistency. Now he goes to one called an implicit inconsistency. Now, an implicit inconsistency is one in which there's some necessary truth that you could add that would create an inconsistency. Now, this is a little bit difficult if you've not done logic and haven't done very much philosophy, but bear with me in this, okay? An implicit inconsistency is an inconsistency that rises from the laws of logic and necessary truths. Now, you may not understand what I mean by necessary truth, so let me unpack that. A necessary truth is a truth that cannot not be true. The opposite of necessary is contingent. Contingent means it might or might not have been true, that there's a state of the world in which this could have not been. That's contingent. Necessary means it has to be true. It's absolutely necessary. Now, you and I, we're not necessary. Did you know that? You're not necessary, I'm not necessary, in this logical sense of the word. We're contingent. We are both contingent. If there is a state of affairs that the world could have taken, a direction the world could have taken, that you and I don't exist, wouldn't have existed. Now, the world would have been much the poorer for us not existing. We both know that, but we are contingent. We're not necessary. In fact, in terms of beings, God is the only necessary being. All other beings are contingent beings. So with that idea, that understanding of necessary and contingent, what is a necessary truth? Well, I don't want to get into all the possibilities for what makes a necessary truth. I just want to focus on one to get you the idea. So mathematical truths are generally considered to be necessary. No matter what universe there might have been, no matter what state of affairs there might have been, no matter what anything might have happened, the universe in which we live in, 1 + 1 would always be 2. There's no other possibility. That's a necessary truth. It cannot not have been true. There's no state of affairs in this world in which that could not have been the case. Okay? That 1 + 1 still equals 2. And with that, notions like more and less, greater and lesser, those are necessary truths. So let's consider a set of statements. Let's do one in which we have Anakin Skywalker and we have Luke Skywalker. And we say Anakin Skywalker is older than Luke Skywalker. Anakin Skywalker is older than Luke Skywalker. And then we might say Luke Skywalker is older than Yoda. And then we might say Yoda is older than Anakin. Now, if you know Star Wars at all, or if you have common sense, you know that that's not true, what I just stated. Because in the story of Star Wars, Luke is not older than Yoda. But we're not talking about the historical truths or the contingent truths. We're not talking about that. We're talking about necessary truths of more and less, greater and lesser, logical things. So even if you don't know anything about Star Wars, you know that one of those statements I just made has to be false, even without knowledge of Star Wars, which means you're a very impoverished person if you don't know that about Star Wars. But even if you didn't know Star Wars, you know that what I just said is false. I said that Anakin Skywalker is older than Luke Skywalker, and I said that Luke is older than Yoda, and Yoda is older than Anakin. Now, you know, just by the laws of logic, that cannot, all those can't be true. Now, none of those statements explicitly contradicts the others. You realize that? Not one explicitly contradicts the others. But there is a necessary truth of the notion of lesser and greater that makes it clear that there is an implicit inconsistency in those statements. You see, if Anakin's older than Luke and Luke is older than Yoda, Yoda can't be older than Anakin. You can't do that. So one of those statements has to be false. How did we arrive at that? We introduced a necessary truth. And that creates the reality of us being able to say, in that, there is an implicit logical inconsistency. Implicit logical inconsistency. Now, that's how you do an implicit inconsistency, is by introducing a necessary truth that by the laws of logic causes us to realize one of those statements actually contradicts the others. And how does this apply to the problem of evil? Well, if we could come up with some necessary truth that we could introduce to that trilemma, the idea of God exists and God is all good, God is all powerful, and evil exists, if we could introduce some necessary truth to that trilemma that would show that by implication, one of those contradicts the others, then it would mean that, yes, there is an inconsistency, and we are inconsistent in believing in God, who is all good, all powerful, in light of the evil in the world. That's what we can. But here's the problem. No atheist has yet come up with a necessary truth that meets this qualification. No atheist has come up with any necessary truth that meets this qualification. And in fact, in his book, Alvin Plantinga goes to extraordinary lengths to try to introduce possible necessary truths. Alvin Plantinga at this point is a gentleman scholar, because he actually looks at the case that is made by his opponent and says, I want to make this case of my opponent as strong as I possibly can before I dismantle it. I want to make it as strong as I can. And Alvin Plantinga comes up with all possible ideas that he can to try to strengthen the atheist's case. Even though Plantinga is arguing for theism, he's trying to make sure that the case he gives to the atheist opponent is as strong as it can possibly be. And Plantinga, the strongest candidate he can come up with for something that might be a necessary truth that would, if you added it to this, would make it irrational or it would make it illogical, inconsistent to believe that there's a God, is that an all-good, all-powerful God would never have a good reason to allow evil. Now, if this could be demonstrated, this idea that an all-good, all-powerful God has no reason, there would never have any reason to allow evil, if that could be demonstrated to be a necessary truth, then it would mean that it's inconsistent to believe in God. But here's the issue. How can you possibly show that this is true, let alone show that it's a necessary truth? You see, the only way you could show that that's true is if you knew every possible reason and had comprehensive, infinite knowledge of all things, is the only way you could do that. And you can't even show that it's true, let alone show that it's a necessary truth, that it's necessary for this to be true. And for the most part, when atheists make this case, honestly, they are resorting to basically a statement of, I can't see any reason why God would allow evil. Now, there's a very technical term in philosophy for that type of an argument where somebody says, I just can't think of any reason why. It's called a no-seum argument. That's actually the term for it in philosophy. It's a no-seum argument. Now, sometimes a no-seum argument actually is valid. If I said to you that, if I said, for example, that I saw a rebel blockade runner land in my backyard, Okay? If I said this, that a rebel blockade runner has landed in my backyard, and you looked out and didn't see one, and I'm not talking about just this little model of one, I'm talking about a real, full-sized one, massive. I've said it landed in my backyard. And you said, no, see him. I don't see one. Then that is a valid usage of a no-see him argument. Why? Because rebel blockade runners are the types of things you'd be able to see in your backyard. But the reasons why God might allow evil and why you might be or might not be aware of these arguments aren't like starships in your backyard. No-see him arguments don't work with certain things. They work with some things. If you see something that is a seeable thing that ought to be seen and you don't see it, then there's a reason to appeal to a no-see him argument. But reasons why God might allow evil don't fall in that category. You have a being who is by definition infinite. You have an entire history of humanity and of the universe. The reason might not be obvious. It would be less like a rebel blockade runner in your backyard and a lot more like a gnat in your backyard. A no-see him argument doesn't work here. And so what Plantinga has shown is that the problem of evil is not a logical problem. The logical problem of evil doesn't rule out the possibility of God's existence. It doesn't rule it out explicitly. We saw that at the beginning. It doesn't rule it out formally. It doesn't rule it out implicitly unless there is some necessary truth, and no one's come up with a necessary truth that you could add to that set of statements to show that it's irrational or inconsistent to believe that a good, powerful God might allow evil. Which means, you see, and what this means practically is, if I can come up with even one reason, doesn't even have to be the right reason, but one reason that is consistent with goodness of God and the power of God and the existence of evil, if I can come up with one reason why the God described in Scripture might allow evil, then the claim of an implicit inconsistency is ruled out. Is ruled out. And so what that means practically is this. It's a brilliant thing that Plantinga does. We don't have to offer what's called a theodicy. That comes from the word theos and dike, that is to say God and righteous or just. And so it's a theodicy is saying this is the reason why God allowed evil in this instance. Okay, we don't have to come up with a theodicy where we actually are able to say, God, this is the reason you caused evil in this, and we can tell somebody, here's why God caused evil right here. We don't have to come up with that. All we have to come up with is a possible reason, a defense of why God might have allowed evil. That lets us off the hook of an implicit inconsistency because it shows that there is not some necessary truth you can add that God would never allow evil, God should never allow evil, that there's that implicit inconsistency that would be introduced by that supposed necessary truth, it shows that actually that truth isn't necessary. It doesn't obtain that it is necessary because we've offered an alternative. We don't have to know the actual reason. We just have to be able to articulate a defense, a possible reason that's consistent with goodness of God, power of God, and existence of evil. And in fact, there are at least two that have been offered throughout church history at different times. And we're not going to get into those deeply, but I want you to be aware of them. One of them is the soul-making defense from Irenaeus of Lyon, who said that evil and suffering are necessary to form us into virtuous people. Plantinga offers, as others have offered throughout church history, not just Plantinga, but before him as well, a free will defense, which is that perhaps a world with moral goodness requires at least the possibility of moral evil. And in the created order, the misuse of good things is always a necessary possibility where there is creaturely moral goodness and choice. And here's the thing. It is generally conceded among philosophers that Alvin Plantinga's defense eliminates the problem of evil as a logical problem, that God does not, to declare that God does not exist. Now, that doesn't, of course, mean atheists have given up. There are, as I said at the beginning, three problems of evil and suffering. The logical problem, which we've just dealt with, and the evidential problem, and the existential problem. We'll look at the evidential and existential problems over the next couple of lectures.